right, welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber. We've got a treat today. We've got somebody who's been in the ecosystem for a little while and has strong opinions that we will definitely get into towards, I think, the second half of today's episode. But I'm joined today by Cory O'Daniel, co-founder and CEO at Massdriver. Cory is a self-described taco aficionado, RC car enthusiast. Sorry, I stumble over that word. But also the enthusiastic about RC, awesome. But also the author of the somewhat controversial. How old is the article by now? The DevOps is bullshit article.
It's like I think it's about 2 years old now, and then the follow-up's about a year old. But it gets tossed back into the internet gears every quarter or so. So
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I feel like any blog post that's 2 years old at this point is either kind of ancient internet archive, or if it does get recirculated, it's now kind of accepted as gospel truth amongst the internet and the internet's disciples by virtue of being brought up time and again, right?
I'll take gospel truth on that.
Awesome. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later in today's conversation. But I want to start off on a topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart as somebody who's been in cloud security for a long time. And that's actually the shift left aspect of it and kind of infrastructure as code. You know, with your company over there at Massdriver, I know that you're doing a lot of infrastructure as code work, and I don't know what the right way to think about it is, but platform automation is maybe a term that comes to mind. I don't know if that's a fair description, but safe to say you have a lot of exposure to the internet as code side of things, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the general, I hate this term because it overlaps with another term that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the term people use is TACO, Terraform Automation and Collaboration. It's like we're in that side of the world. I love tacos, but I hate such a cherished word being used to describe software. At that end, like, you know, most of the products in the space, ours included and some of our competitors, we all work with tools besides Terraform. So, you know, Bicep, CloudFormation, Helm, like the whole gamut. But
yeah,
I think infrastructure automation, platform automation is probably the way to think of it.
Cool. So on that side, when I think about platform automation, you know, I started at AWS in 2010. I left a little while later. I've been in the cloud ecosystem ever since. In the early days of infrastructure as code, all we really saw was like the simplest of kind of plans or templates, right? It's like, I don't want to click ops my way towards having a 3-tier architecture of a web server, an app server, and database server. I want to automate the three of those things come together. And obviously that has gotten considerably more complex as we've layered in, you know, let's say like least privileged IAM principles that we might want to deploy for any workload specific purpose, and, you know, complex VPC structures and things like that. But the long and short of it has, in my mind, for a long time been making sure that the configuration of any set of infrastructure resources that we're provisioning is designed securely. Is that still the main focus of, let's say, the security lens of infrastructure as code? Or are there more things that people are thinking about now as they look at, like, hey, is my Terraform template good or my Terraform plan secure?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely is a concern. I think that there's a lot of tools you're kind of seeing in the space now. There's like the TFSECs, the OPAs, checkoffs. It's like a ton of tools you can kind of throw in there to like make sure that you're enforcing policies, whether they're secure or not.
Yeah.
But like, I think one of the things that we have to go up against is like the cloud. Like, we think of the cloud as two things. Like, if I were to say, hey, the cloud is secure and easy, people would nod their head. They'd be like, yeah, the cloud is secure. It's fucking not either of those things. It's not secure by default. Like, you have to.
Well, it's definitely not easy.
And it's definitely not easy, right? It's like these two things that we like think like, secure and easy, the cloud. It's like, no, that does not describe our lives whatsoever, right? It's like one of the things I think that's still hard with infrastructure as code is like we can shift left and say like shift sec onto engineers, but like there's a ton of stuff that's already been shifted left onto them, right? So when you're designing infrastructure and trying to focus on security, it's like, okay, well, you have to understand security, then you have to understand like the security domains of an individual cloud service, right? RDS versus IAM in general versus EC2 are very different beasts, right? And it requires a level of experience with those services. And so it's, I think, really hard still in infrastructure as code is like the cloud doesn't give you a great secure system by default, right? You have to, I have to turn on encryption. I have to not use star on my IAM policies, right? So there's really an onus on the person writing the code to make sure that happens, right? And whether that's me throwing some checkoff policies on there, or OPA policies at the end of the day, or thinking about the way that we design our modules in the first place, I think is probably one of the better places to do it, right? Because the thing that's rough with using these tools that kind of scan stuff after the fact is somebody might forget to copy your CI/CD pipeline, right? And you put checkoff policies in there all day long, but if your engineers are like copying or referencing a Terraform module from another repo and they don't bring the CI policies with it, like all for naught.
Yeah.
You think you're doing things great as an ops person, CI pipeline's not running, right? I think one of the things that we kind of missed with DevOps and shifting things left is paying attention to like how much we're shifting onto an engineer's plate and what should we be shifting onto an engineer's plate. Like we do want self-service, like the idea of engineers being able to get things themselves instead of like tapping ops, DevOps, SRE platform, whoever's shoulder and asking for it, or making a request through ServiceNow or whatever, right? Like that sucks. Like we all agree that sucks. Like we want these people to have some sort of agency to manage their own infrastructure, but do we want them to understand RDS and IAM and VPC rules and subnets and all of that stuff just to be able to get a database? I'd say no, right? So I think one of the important things for many teams when they're designing stuff and designing modules for their developers is essentially designing like a more constrained view of the cloud. So instead of trying to make modules that kind of let you do whatever you want, actually codify your policies into your modules and expose a surface layer to your developers, essentially like the variables for like a Terraform module or OpenTofu module that make sense to your developers. Like they care about the version of Postgres. They might care about some settings that are on in the database, but zonal replication, they probably don't care about as long as it's highly available. They don't care if it's 2, 3, 4, 200 zones, right? And then when it comes to security, it's like, should they have to think about security groups? I'd say no. Like why expose to them, right? Just put that stuff in place. And instead of trying to make the most glamorous, amazing Terraform module in the world, give somebody something that's usable by them and makes all the hard decisions for them.
Yeah, and I mean, along those lines, what you're describing sounds to me an awful lot like, let's say the early days of Service Catalog from a ClickOps perspective in a lot of organizations, because they would get to those situations where, for whatever reason, and it might have been in many cases, it was like a data sovereignty thing where it's like, hey, we can only run in these regions because of the physical location of the infrastructure for whatever, AWS or Azure region that they were looking at. Or it might have been like, oh, we have an enterprise license agreement and a savings plan with whatever cloud provider for particular instance types. And so you would see these kind of codified policies around like, no, Cory, you can't just launch any EC2 instance in any region, but you can launch absolutely these instance types in these regions. And that's very much, available to you to go do whatever you need to do to get your job done. And it sounds like what you're describing is kind of like, well, why don't we just like take that concept and codify it towards the left so that any engineer designing an infrastructure as code, plan, or template they don't have to your point, like they don't have to know about zonal replication. There's like organizational policies that say like, okay, these are the zonal replication settings that we have, and you can launch into whatever with these, security configuration constraints in place. Is that kind of the way to think about it?
I mean, I think so. That's the way that we've started doing a lot of our modules and with customers that we work with, especially when we're doing like we do like statements of work and like fractional ops hours for as a part of our service. And so we'll work with companies that have like no idea how most of this stuff works, and like should they? Probably not. Eventually, yeah. But like probably not like at the stage that they're at. And one of the ways that we've started to try to deliver stuff is focusing more on like the availability, right? So like that'll be an actual input to like a Terraform module. It's like, how available does this environment need to be? Is it a production environment? Is it highly available, or is it like a dev environment? And like to a developer, that's easy to reason about. It's like, oh, this is our checkout. This absolutely has to be high availability, right? Or this is like user sign up. It should be available, but not as high as checkout. Like checkout takes precedent, right? That thing always needs to be up. And what we'll tend to do is model out like things like replication and security configurations like inside the module that will kind of switch based off of the availability that they've said that they need. I need this to be highly available. It's like, okay, we'll make the zonal decisions for you. But if you set this in developer mode, it's just going to be a single instance sitting in like a single zone, right? And so kind of getting it in the language of the developers, like that's, I think, how you get to that. You build it, you run it. Like the thing that we were promised with DevOps, right? You build it, you run it. It's like that made sense 10 years ago, but now there's just too much to reason about to still write software that makes a company money at the end of the day. But if as an ops person on your team, if I can say, okay, well, we've thought through all these different constraints, we've got all these different regions that are deployed, different countries that we're in, and like this is the way that we want all of our databases to run, and here's a very limited interface for you developers. Like, guess what? That's what most developers want. Like, most developers want that Heroku experience. They're forced into the Terraform and AWS experience by like getting into a large team or having massive scale, right? And so I think you can develop and deliver your infrastructure as code to your team in a way that feels a lot more platform-esque, rather than just saying like, here is all the configuration for S3. That's terrifying. There's like 120 configuration options for an S3 bucket, but saying here's a module for how we log, and here's a module for how we take FTP uploads. Like, those are very specific. You can start to filter out a lot of the world and a lot of the configuration when you start to think through it through the lens of like who's going to be using it and what is the case in which they'll be using it for.
But I think something you said there kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people assume to be true, which is that like a lot of people think every developer wants full admin rights to everything. And also every developer wants the rights to launch the biggest instances that they can, so that their code always flies, like whatever they develop is always amazingly performant, because sure, when you put it on, 16 core GPU with X terabytes of memory, it's going to run amazingly. You don't find that to be true?
So I think that developers want to be not hindered. They don't want to be obstructed, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like, we have this like project management chain, right? We're a tool. We're a tool by a business to build software because they don't know how, right? Like, we got to get stuff done. We got to get stuff shipped. Do they want admin rights to everything? I don't necessarily think so, but they do want to be able to make the changes they need to make, right? And like, you'll see a little bit of friction when you start to like change the way you think about modules and you start to design them with these smaller interfaces. But that's good software iteration, right? Your customer is saying, hey, the functionality is not here, right? I would rather somebody come to me and say, hey, this one attribute that I need isn't exposed to me in this Terraform module. Like, I opened a PR to add it, or can you open a PR to add it, versus this thing took 150 inputs and I couldn't figure out what 130 of them were. Can you help me? And it's like, okay, I'm going to do that today, and then I'm going to do it to the next person tomorrow and the next person tomorrow, right? So it's like that collaboration of like, hey, this isn't working the way I need. Like, let's iterate on it. Feels much more DevOpsy than here's the entire kitchen sink, good luck, and when you need help, make sure to block yourself by tapping me on the shoulder, which is where a lot of companies still sit today. So I think as far as like getting them those admin rights, like I think it's like just a matter of like thinking about like what are the right level of configuration for them that can feel like they have that full control of the cloud. And again, I think you have to think about when you're designing, and I feel like this is really easy to go wrong with open source and like Terraform modules and Helm charts, but you have to think about who you're designing it for. When you're not designing it for anybody, and that's what we see a lot in the Terraform registry, then what do you've got? Go look at the VPC module. It's got 110 inputs. It's like, what are they? I have no idea. Like, when you're like, okay, I'm designing a VPC module for my team, it starts to be very different, right? And I think one of the things that we get to a lot in infrastructure as code is, there's an official AWS VPC module. It's like, okay, you're just re-representing the AWS API in a different way at that point in time, right? Like, you're exposing so many attributes, it's literally just the same API, but like this like useless thin abstraction. Like, what expertise are we putting in there? Say if you look at any major registry module, there's none. It's just pass through on variables. Variables route to attributes. Variables route to attributes. There's no value in it, right? And I think that a lot of times, like when you're looking towards those modules, like you're just better off writing it yourself, right? Like, because then you can start to bring in your practices. You can bring in like what we want to expose, and that's what I don't see enough people doing. That I see when we do it with people really kind of unlock that velocity in their org. They're starting to think of, I need Postgres, not I need AWS Aurora RDS Postgres, right? Like, yeah.
But to that point, I mean, I'm curious. It's like 2024. I'm like legally required to ask about AI. Is there not like a, some aspect of this where I can just describe to some, LLM like, hey, this is the thing that I'm trying to do, and the LLM can infer from it all the rest of the inputs? Like, is that a thing? Is that going to become a thing?
It might. We did our fundraising round last year. I'm bearish on AI. I mean, I use it day to day, but I'm still very bearish on it. Like I use it in a very tinkerish way. Like I don't do anything major with AI. And when we raised our
Same for me, by the way.
yeah, it's like I'll use it to like, hey, here's 8 points I want to make to my VCs, like make it sound a little less abrupt. Send it out, right? Or like, hey, I've got this Terraform module and like I want to, do a refactoring on like the naming for the resource names. Okay, great, But giving me net new infrastructure, like some of our competitors are like throwing the AI around there, and we did our fundraise last year very specifically without using the words AI on our site anywhere or in our pitch deck. We didn't mention it, and we're able to do our round, and we were very proud of that. And we may bring in AI tools into Massdriver in the near future, but I think a couple of things are terrifying about it. So one, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like if you look at AI, where you see it like crushing is like, hey, write a story. Okay, great. Plenty of stories. The interesting thing about stories is authors generally, for most of history, have gone through a publisher and an editor. So really, literally only the best of the best works are being mined. Art is very similar. You're putting stuff up on Behance, you're putting stuff up on different art sites. You're trying to show off your work. When it comes to software developers, you look at GitHub at any point in time, that's not our best work. That was what we had to do to get the job done at that point in time, right? Yeah. Or you look at a Medium article, this was me trying to figure out how to do this. This isn't the best, but no, this is how you can cobble these two things together, right? The data that we train AI on around cloud operations is very like infantile. Like it's not our best. And it's also missing half the picture. This is how you build a great Postgres module. It's like, okay, for what?
What purpose?
Yeah. For what purpose, right? Like it's like, oh, well, this is I saw this on the AWS RDS module registry. Like here it is. And it's like, okay, well, what was that database designed to do? It's missing the context. It doesn't understand requests, our throughput, our domains, right?
Yeah. But if you trained it on like, let's say, peer-reviewed PRs that have been approved and gone into production, granted, like I think a lot of organizations wouldn't have the velocity or the volume of PRs to actually like constitute a meaningful training corpus. But in a larger organization where you've got like, let's say, a track record of a couple of years worth of PRs on infrastructure as code, like, where they're Terraform or they're CloudFormation driven PRs, I would say that you could probably get a somewhat meaningful sample size for your organization. Not general purpose, but they might be like well tuned to your organizational policies and to like, let's say, the standards and the defaults that you have for your company.
I think you definitely get there. Yeah. But I mean, then there's the next problem, which is, okay, somebody generated this code. I don't know what came out of it. Like, I don't know cloud operations. I don't know Terraform. I don't know RDS. It gave me something and I Terraform applied it and it exited 0. So does that mean, Does that mean it works and it's secure and it's compliant? I have no idea, right? So like I went through this recently because one of our competitors launched like an AI thing, and I was like, okay, great. So I popped over to it, and I was like, I need a Kubernetes cluster that will pass CIS and could pass SOC 2 given these like constraints about my business. And literally it was like new aws.eks, and then there was a comment section where it was just like commented and it was like, put your configuration SOC 2 compliance and CIS here. And I'm like,
how helpful is that?
I was like, it's green. If I run it, it actually built a cluster, but like it didn't take any of my constraints into account, right? So that's the other thing is like, if you're a novice or don't know, most AI will confidently tell you the wrong thing and be fine with it, right? The amount of times I've used Chat GPT 4.0 in the past couple of days where I'm like I can tell that it's telling me something because it thinks it's what I want to hear. And I'm like, that's not right at all. And it's like, well, yeah, it's not right. But like you asked, and I'm like, I asked you can tell me no, robot. Like, Like, but it'll just be like, yes, this is how you do it. It's like, I don't think they have a free plan. Right? It's like, oh, they don't have a free plan. I just said they did in case they do. And it's like, I'm like more confused than like when I started this thing, right? So I think like that's I think mildly problematic. I think on the other side of it though is like, okay, I don't understand what I'm doing. I'm asking AI to generate it. If I run this through Terraform or Helm or whatever, it'll exit 0, but does it mean it met all these requirements, right? If if it does or doesn't, but it deploys some infrastructure either way. Now, who's missing the context? I'm missing the context as a developer, and so is the ops people. I have no idea what put this thing into production. Now, could I say, hey, here's a couple of prompts, like make sure you always include these tags? Yes, that's a great place for it, right? Can I say, hey, make sure that, any given module, there's one name field, and we use that name with suffixes for all the resources that are created. Like, great, that's a great policy to put in. And I think you can do successful things with that, but like, can you AI away operations and expertise? I think we're pretty far from that.
Or can you AI correctly get the 95 of those 110 fields on the VPC module that the developer doesn't want to deal with, or that the developer actually has no opinion or any knowledge or understanding of.
Exactly.
Yeah, I take your point.
Yeah.
I want to shift gears for a second. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what's going on. We've talked about Terraform a couple of times, and obviously that's a like super well known and widely adopted, I don't know, standard technology format. I don't know what the right thing to actually even call Terraform is at this point.
Ooh, yeah.
But, like what, well, first of all, let's not answer that question. Let's just talk about kind of what's happened in that community, the hard fork, the license changes, etc. For those who haven't really followed this story, like I'm sure you live this every day to day in a lot of the work that you do. So you're probably way more familiar with it than I am, or than a lot of our audience is. So give us your take, if you would.
Yeah, so I'll give you the rundown, and then before I switch into my opinion mode, I'll give you a flag up. So, yeah, it was about this time last year, I think, right around August. HashiCorp changed the licensing of many of their like flagship open source projects from MIT to BUSL, B-U-S-L, Business Source License. Sometimes misabbreviated as BSL. So if you look into it, you'll see BUSL and BSL, but the technical one's BUSL. Okay. And the reason they did this was, at the time, they said that there was a whole fleet of companies that were competitors with HashiCorp using HashiCorp's products to make money.
Okay.
I don't know. Within months of this, they also announced the IBM merger. So, was it us or was it that? Who knows? But
doesn't matter.
They changed the license for some reason. And so, around this time, a bunch of organizations were kind of put in a tight spot, right? All VC backed. So it's okay. Well, you can no longer use Terraform or Vault or whatever the tool is that you kind of competed with. So go out of business or pivot or fork the thing, right? And so at the time, it was very confusing to everybody what was going on. Like, consultants were confused. Like, HashiCorp has a PSO arm, professional services arm. If I do consulting and write Terraform, am I competing with HashiCorp's PSO arm, right? So it was like, can I use this, right? The CNCF was like, are we competitors? Like, some of our products compete with HashiCorp products. Like, are we competitors, right? So there was just a ton of vagueness in this change. And then so HashiCorp started releasing these FAQs. And so it seemed like every time somebody emailed them to ask them a question, they'd publish an FAQ. And so the license was partially a license file and then partially just growing FAQ blog post. And that's kind of where, when you started seeing these FAQs come out, it's you start to get a little bit of clarity as to who this affected or not. And in the meantime, I'd reached out to a buddy of mine who worked at Spacelift, and I was like, this is concerning. And he was like, well, we're already talking to people, figure out what to do about it. And so there's about 7 orgs that kind of came together over a weekend, try to figure out, is this plausible to take a fork of Terraform? Now, there's a couple other companies that have started doing forks of some of the other projects, but I only really know the Terraform S thing. So we decided to fork it. And then from there, it was, trying to build up all the stuff around it to support, an open source community driven team around what became OpenTofu. And so, we first announced the project. There was a ton of support. There was also a ton of people very mad. And so we're getting into
a ton of HashiCorp people very mad, or a ton of
shills. Sorry, if you're hearing this and you're like, I was very mad about OpenTofu existing, you're a shill. The shills. So I don't know, those people coming out of the woodworks. Sorry, I said shills. I shouldn't have said shills. Some of you are shills, but it was more I think it was 2 classes of people. There were actual shills, and there are a couple of shills out there. And then there were people that I think took HashiCorp's original phrasing as to why they did this change, and they took it to heart. Because like me, I'm a software developer who's used HashiCorp tools since before HashiCorp existed. I was using Vagrant before there was even a HashiCorp, right? And so this is a brand that as a developer, I've kind of fallen in love with over the past decade, right? Like I saw them go from barely existing to this company that builds all this tools to the IPO'd, right? Like I'm using them at other companies that, I'm doing consulting for. And so in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is like the company, like to look up to as a software engineer, as a founder, right? And so when they made this change, I think there was a lot of people that were enamored for good reason with HashiCorp and their philosophy around open source software development. I think when they heard that, oh, people are taking advantage of us, I think people were like, well, how dare you take advantage of HashiCorp and make a competing product to them. But then what I think started to happen after that was like the shakeout, right? Like once everything started like to settle and people saw that this was a real community driven like project, OpenTofu, I think people started to see like some of the cracks. And so when you start looking at the cracks, this is where we'll get into my opinion, just not to freak anybody out. This is Cory O'Daniel speaking here. When you start looking at the cracks in that, the image that they were trying to portray there. The reality is a few years ago, they cut off open source contributions to Terraform. There's even a blog post by HashiCorp about them no longer taking community contributions. The reason why is they didn't have the staff to deal with it, right? So now what you're seeing is a tool for about 2 years that's just kind of languishing. Anybody who lived through that 0.13 phase, it was like 0.7 to 0.13 to 1, like that took a very long time to get there. And there's a lot of PRs that never made it through, a lot of issues, like 500 upvotes that just never made it through, right? So that's happening, right? Or that's not happening, as it were, right? People making contributions to it. And now OpenTofu is actually trying to have an RFC process that is not what the companies that are involved in it want. It's what does the community want in this thing? And if we get good functionality in here, we'll build our products to support it, but we're not making decisions on PRs and issues based on our businesses. The community, right? And so I think people start to see these cracks around they weren't actually doing it for the community. Like they're doing a lot of this because they have business interests, which makes sense. I got VCs too. Make those decisions. But to say that we're making this change because people are abusing it and they haven't wanted to help, I don't think that they saw 7 groups getting together that actually wanted to help and could pull this off, right? And so that's where we are today. Is now we got OpenTofu out. We've got it in the Linux Foundation, getting it into CNCF. We have OpenTofu days at KubeCon. And, we 20,000, 22,000 something stars on GitHub, a few million registry downloads a day, like starting to have uptick. And the reason why is people are seeing us, A, maintain that compatibility with Terraform that we promised to do, and B, hitting the features that people have been asking for years that haven't landed in main, right? And I think that's where, the rubber hits the road, is like we're actually building the stuff that people have wanted for a long time. And so now you're starting to see these opinions change and people saying OpenTofu is the way to go, right? You see people saying it on Reddit. I was just on Reddit this morning. Somebody's like, hey, like I'm thinking about Terraform Cloud versus Atlantis. And everybody's like, OpenTofu, right? And so like you're starting to see that velocity, which I think is great. But when it first happened, it was a lot of people backed us. It was easy to sign a thing, but it was just like there was as many people that were just mad on Reddit and Hacker News. This may not go as well as we hope it does, and it's gone pretty well so far.
And so for a developer who is kind of coming from Terraform, you're saying like compatibility is guaranteed. So anything that you've built historically, you should be able to plug in and run just as you always have.
Yeah, so I mean, you can go the extreme route or like the simple route about this. So what I suggest is if you've already got like good Terraform pipelines, take your plan and run your plan twice. Once with the OpenTofu binary, once with the Terraform binary. And if you take those and diff them, the only diff you should see is in one it says Terraform and one it says OpenTofu. It should be identical otherwise. And so what we suggest with a lot of customers that are already on Terraform was to throw this in their CI and just diff it and see if there's anything besides OpenTofu, like the name change showing up, right?
Yeah.
And what you'll see is like they're very much identical because the software is mostly identical. So that's one great way to like start getting in there. It's like throw the plan in there and see that it's like generating the right plans. You feel confident about it. If you're using like Atlantis or something like that, like you'll see the PR, you'll get 2 comments posted, one about OpenTofu, one about Terraform on like your GitHub Actions or your GitHub PRs. That one feels pretty good. But to kind of show like how like compatible they are, like I have an alias in my shell called T. It's always been T. Terraform. They got a single letter in my aliases. And now it 50/50s. So whenever at any point in time when I'm like doing local development, I have no idea which tool I'm using. And I do that just to make sure that I'm aware of like any sort of incompatibilities we run against, right? And so pretty cool. That's like the hardcore one, I think.
Yeah.
is doing that. I mean, you're gonna see compatibility. Now, the one catch is OpenTofu will always be a little bit behind Terraform and Terraform functionality. But then we're ahead of Terraform and non-Terraform functionality, right? So the end-to-end encryption of state files, right? So like talking about security of ISC, there's securing of your cloud resources, but then there's securing your infrastructure, like securing the code itself, right?
Yeah.
And that is like a whole other bag of worms besides just securing the cloud services. So end-to-end encryption of state. We've got the dynamic functions. So you instead of like the functions that you get with Terraform out of the box, or trying to like, if you've ever written a Terraform provider, like you can use data resources to like make functions if you try really hard. You can now package custom functions with providers. Well, with OpenTofu, you can also drop in Go and Lua code, and you don't have to have custom providers for your functions. You can just get dynamic functions, right? And so like that's the kind of stuff that I think is really important for continuing to move the community forward, and I think people are really excited about. It's like seeing that stuff that people are just waiting for forever. The other big one is dynamic provider configuration, right? So if you've ever had a team where you've like tried to lay down a Kubernetes cluster, and then you're like, oh, on all of our Kubernetes clusters we're using Let's Encrypt and external DNS, and we don't want to put that in a separate Terraform module. It's always kind of been a pain to initialize Kubernetes and then initialize the Kubernetes provider so that you can lay down some Helm charts or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so with this dynamic provider configuration, you'll be able to reconfigure providers effectively on the fly. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, which is big if you're doing a bunch of Kubernetes stuff.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It's actually one of the areas that I think like I've seen customers struggle with on the infrastructure as code side. So aside from just like, let's say, checking the configuration of all the resources, one of the other patterns that I've seen with a lot of, let's say, larger, let's say, more traditional organizations that are trying to be quote unquote cloud native is that they'll be like, oh, okay, we're going to open the doors or open the gates to the developers a little bit more. But you know what? There's 2 areas where our security teams are going to get involved. And almost like whenever you hear that, without fail, it's VPC structures and IAM roles. And so like you'll see then they're like, hey, Cory developer, go do whatever you need to do, but you can only use these VPCs and these IAM roles. And generally speaking, that can work out relatively well. But where I see it falling short is when you, as the developer, don't have a good understanding of what the settings of those environments or of those permissions and role sets are. It's where you're like, okay, great, I'm going to use this thing. And you look and you pick some random role off of paper, or you choose some VPC based on your limited understanding of what the production environment looks like. And then all of a sudden you end up with like an unintentional configuration where, let's say, some service that you're trying to expose, that port is by default blocked. Or some service that you launched, actually it's open and you don't want it to be open because you lack that understanding. It's like this mix of where you're trying to do like net new stuff defined as code into an environment that's already running, whose code is not accessible to the person launching into it. And like that mismatch I've seen a number of times. Awesome. But just to kind of come back on the OpenTofu stuff, just to kind of confirm, like, so from a licensing perspective, gone back to the MIT license or picked a different license as it's gone to the Linux Foundation?
You know what? I should know this off the top of my head. I cannot remember. Off the top of my head. This is funny. Sorry, we've been doing a bunch of licensing ourselves around some stuff that we're going to be releasing open source. I'm just like, I can't remember who was what. So, pardon me for being an idiot. It's the what is it? It's not AGP. Mozilla, the MPL.
Mozilla Public License.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah, we're doing stuff under MIT. Massdriver.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've only got a couple minutes left, and I want to finish up on, the thing that we talked about at the beginning. So let's talk about DevOps as bullshit. So first of all, why is it bullshit? Every organization that I talk to, and it's funny, like we do API security, which is this kind of unique beast because APIs are a funny thing. And I often repeat this line when people ask me, they're like, well, API security, like, is that AppSec? Is that like CloudSec? Is that secure product and coding and whatnot? And I'm like, well, generally speaking, yes, it's all of the above. But actually, most security teams care about it from the perspective of what data is potentially exposed or breachable behind this poorly written API. And so I tend to think of it from that perspective. But the reason I bring this up is that, like, typically when there is a problem with an API that leaves data vulnerable, it's almost always in the design. And so you kind of always have to go back to the source of, like, who wrote this API. And so then people tend to bring in the whole, like, oh, this is a DevSecOps problem. You need to incorporate, like, the developers and give them the security tooling and the security knowledge to build a secure API and give them pointers to fixing their API and so on. So that's where my exposure to this side of the world tends to be on a regular basis. But you live it day to day. Like, why is DevOps bullshit?
Yes, I think it's a couple of things. So one, we still can't define it 10 years in, right? There's like, there's like there's DevOps culture, which is important. And then there's like the DevOps team or the role, right? Which I want to be crystal clear. If you have a DevOps title today, your work is important and the stuff that you're doing is important, right? Like, I feel like that's something that was kind of missed. People are like, oh, are you like tearing down these people? It's like, no, that was my title for the longest time. And the entire time I'm like, this isn't a title, it's a job, it's a culture, it's how we do things, it's not me. And it just, a lot of companies, you will try to fight that, but you are a salmon swimming upstream, right? So A, we already have like two definitions. I think that's the first one. B, the phrase was coined when the world was very different, right? It was 2008, 2010. Like, we were running software on VMs, right?
Okay.
It was, ops was setting up these VMs and networks for us. We were trying to figure out how to get software on them, right? I feel like that has kind of tainted what DevOps has become. Many people just consider DevOps like the CI/CD portion, right? So it's like a lot of, like, you'll see a lot of job descriptions where you're like, literally, this is a CI/CD engineer. You're a YAML engineer. DevOps, it's the DevOps role. And it's like, okay, some companies it's support, some companies it's not. It's like, so it's just vague. Like, if I said today, I've got a DevOps role open for you, you wouldn't know what I was talking about. And so, like, that right there, that is just bullshit. Now, here's the thing I think it's a little bit more bullshit is we haven't adapted the definition of DevOps, if we could get it right, to fit the world that we're in today. 2010 versus 2024 deploying software, it looks very different, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
We didn't really count like the cloud, big C, in DevOps back then. It was like EC2 was around, like you had like classic VPCs, just trying to get your software on some VMs. But now it's like, okay, my Docker files, is that me or is that you? Or am I doing DevOps and I'm in charge of the Docker files? Now I got to get this thing to a Kubernetes cluster. But my application, which is written in Docker, is using step functions to trigger some state machine stuff, which is backed by a Lambda and maybe some stuff on S3. And so now I've got this like cloud stuff that it's not just how I run my software, it's how my software functions, right? So like the way that we think about our apps has changed. Like, we're no longer running on the cloud, we're composed of cloud, right? And so am I doing DevOps by writing some Terraform to make an S3 bucket? Or is that just a part of writing my software, right? And I feel like we haven't really incorporated that back into the original definition of DevOps, which we still haven't gotten down, right? And so here's where I think, so that's A and B. The third part is we're not doing it. Like,
yeah,
there's so many companies you look at today and you're like, and you can see this in the Dora report. The Dora report is my favorite illustration of this, like the report for DevOps folks, right? There's so many companies I meet today where they're like, we have a DevOps team, we have a global cloud operations team, we got SREs, we got platform engineers, and I'm like, okay, like, what are they, like, you sound like Google, like, what are all these people doing? And it's like, they all write YAML. And like, we just we page them when shit's broken. It's like, if you're paging somebody else, like, you're not building it and running it, or maybe you're building it and running it and just calling somebody else for support, right? But when you look at like things like the Dora report, you start to see like 50% of companies an outage lasts multiple days, right? You look at state of CD report, 30% of companies that responded to the state of CD report said that they were doing infrastructure automation. And so like when you start looking at this, it's like, okay, 50% of people are deploying once a month and they have multi-day outages. Only 30% of organizations are doing infrastructure as code at all. It's like, well, if you aren't codifying your infrastructure, how are you automating it?
Yeah.
How are you making it easier for your engineer to make that step function that calls a Lambda that makes an S3 bucket? Are they going and doing that themselves? Are they click opsing it? Because if they are, that just sounds like a lot of manual toil. It sounds like you've shifted responsibility left, but not the expertise, right? And that's where many teams are kind of sitting, is like, hey, this person does it for me. You could argue whether or not that's DevOps or not. Or it's like, I do it all, but I don't really know. And my product manager wants me to get this shit out on Friday. So I'm going to guess through all these things that you've exposed to me via Terraform until it works. And if it works, it's fine. If it's secure, I don't know. It's going to be the security guy's problem when something breaches, right? It's going to be right. What about cloud costs? Whose problem is that? Is that mine? In a DevSecOps world, like, is that me? Or is it the CFO getting mad 3 to 6 months from now when he's like, why is the cloud bill so high? And it's like, oh, because all these engineers keep just deploying metal with 128 gigs of RAM, so their stuff never goes down, right? And so I feel like we didn't have a good definition of it. It kind of like wriggled out of our hands over the past 14 years while the cloud has kind of just consumed everything. And now we don't have a definition of it, but at the same time, like, we need it. There's more companies that are becoming software companies. There's more people that are moving to the cloud. I don't know about you, but I get a breach notice like maybe every 2 weeks now. It's more important than it was 14 years ago, and we're still, for many companies, in the exact same place we were 14 years ago. And like, that's why it feels like bullshit to me. We couldn't define it. We couldn't get it to kind of take on this full picture of the cloud. And many of us are still where we were then, right? And that's one of the things that we're trying to help with, is like trying to like bridge that talent gap. Like, there's just not enough people with that expertise at the same time. There's a ton of software developers out there, but most of them have spent their time like developing on a PaaS, which is great. But then when they get into the cloud, it's like the only way they're going to learn about it is in production. Like, you're not going to learn the same things on that free tier from AWS that you'll learn in a production system, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak firsthand on the truth of that point for sure. You know, it's like when I started my career pre-cloud, like, you didn't learn about infrastructure and data centers until you actually like built one and made that 3 a.m. drive to swap out the failed hard drive and recover the corrupt file system and all the things that went into it. And, you know, and to your point, you also learned the lessons of that, and you took your hard knocks, and then you got better with every iteration, and every outage really informed, you know, how you design things moving forward. And so do you think that like there's a difference between smaller companies and larger companies as far as how they embrace this? And, you know, like, because my sense is that smaller organizations, if I think about what I might have originally understood DevOps to mean, and everybody's seen the kind of like Infinity 8 for, you know, like release, measure, iterate, improve, you know, blah, 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 plan, design, improve, etc. Like, you know, smaller companies, just by virtue of being resource constrained, are where I see the same engineers who wrote the code being the ones responding to the outages and having to take those lessons learned and get better for the next time. Mm-hmm. Is that just kind of like small sample size and representative of small organizations, or is that kind of a broader truth that you've seen as well?
No, that honestly, I feel like some of the teams that are doing like DevOps the best are the smallest teams, because it's like you only have so many people, right? Somebody has to do it, right? And what I've seen happen more times than not, and this is actually how I became a DevOps engineer, was I was the person on the team that, for whatever reason, you know, what happened to me, my boss was like, this person knows the most about the cloud.
AWS.
So you're the ops person now, right? And all of a sudden it's just like velocity on the product dies, because like, oh, they take this person that was doing a ton for the product that they're trying to sell. They're like, you are now supporting these 7 other people because you have the most experience there, right? And that happens a lot, where it's like, oh, this is my one ops person now, right? And like, that is where I feel like things start to go a bit haywire. Now you've got this one person who's probably doing a job they don't necessarily love, right? They joined to work on your product, but now they're kind of supporting these 7 other people, and you got one. They call out sick. Oh, they go on vacation, right?
Yeah.
thing breaks at 2 a.m. too many times in a row, like you're starting to wear that person down, right? And so I feel like that's a great place to start, but like almost the immediate place people go is, well, we need to hire ourselves an ops person, right? Or they won't do that where they grab that person and say, you're the ops person now. They'll say, let's post a JD and get our first ops person in here. That is the most terrifying job description in the world for me. I'm like, oh shit, you guys have been in business for 5 years and have never had somebody like managing all this stuff. And like day one, I'm gonna have 20 developers mad at me. Like I'm walking knee deep in the debt and I'm the only one. You're not hiring us in pairs. Like that's a scary place. That's a scary job description for me. So yeah, I mean, I feel like the early stage companies, like they kind of get it. They're building it and they're running it. But I also think another place that is fine is just using a PaaS, right? And this is, you won't come to Massdriver if you're using a PaaS, and that's fine. But because I honestly, at the end of the day, care more about your software being secure than making an extra few $1,000s a year off you. There's nothing wrong with running your business on a PaaS until you are ready to start adopting the cloud. Now, the problem is a lot of people are starting to adopt cloud earlier, right? Because you are getting things in there that are appealing to you, right? You're running on a Heroku, which is great, but then you need to run, I don't know, your Claude Sonnet model on, SageMaker or whatever, right? So okay, now I've got a foot in to AWS. Now I've got two platforms. I'm managing Heroku stuff and I'm managing AWS stuff, right? And it's like, well, we're already using AWS. Why don't we just use that for Object Store, right? And you kind of just start stacking on more and more stuff. So I think it's fine to like start simple, and we probably should be starting simple more often, but I think that the cloud has found its way to creep into your simple architectures earlier and earlier.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think that is where we leave you. Not with necessarily words of sage wisdom for how you should be doing things better, but with just some observations about the state of things. So, Cory, thank you so much for taking the time. For people who want to learn more about you, the work that you're doing, your team, I know it's massdriver.cloud. Anywhere else that they should check out?
Yeah, our YouTube channel. So we do webinars every Wednesday on just different cloud topics, cloud migrations, like infrastructure as code best practices. So you can check out our YouTube channel, Massdriver Cloud on YouTube. We've got a bunch of stuff up there. And then I'm Cory O'Daniel pretty much everywhere. So Twitter, LinkedIn, all that jazz. And then we also are the sponsors of the Platform Engineering Podcast. So great podcast to check out if you want to hear all things cloud operations.
All right. Well, we will have the podcast, the YouTube channel, and Massdriver linked. Cory O'Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Modern Cyber. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.